Ladies and gentlemen, good day. I will be presenting a very interesting topic about ethics and research. Research is the pillar of knowledge and it constitutes an integral part of progress. Ethics are broadly the set of rules, written and unwritten, that govern our expectations of our own and others' behavior. So let's define first what is research ethics. Research ethics involves the application of fundamental ethical principles to research activities, which include the design and implementation of research, respect towards society and others, the use of resources and research outputs, scientific misconduct, and the regulation of research. What is ethical consideration? Ethical considerations in research are a set of principles that guide any research designs and practices. Scientists and researchers must always adhere to a certain code of conduct when collecting data from people. The goals of human research often include understanding real-life phenomena, studying effective treatments, investigating behaviors, and improving lives in other ways. What you decide to research and how you conduct the research involve key ethical considerations. These ethical considerations work to, first, protect the rights of research participants, second, to enhance the research validity, and third is to maintain scientific integrity. Research ethics are important for a number of reasons. First is it promotes the aims of research such as expanding knowledge. Second, it supports the values required for collaborative work such as mutual respect and fairness. Third, it means that researchers can be held accountable for their actions. The fourth is it ensures that public can trust research. And lastly, research ethics supports important social and moral values such as the principle of doing no harm to others. Research ethics matters for scientific integrity, human rights, and dignity, and collaboration between science and society. These principles make sure that participation in studies is voluntary, informed, and safe for research subjects. Defying research ethics will also lower the credibility of research because it's hard for others to trust the data or information if your methods are morally questionable. The following are the guiding principles for an ethical research. We have honesty and integrity, objectivity, morality, prudence, openness, respect for intellectual property, confidentiality, responsible publication, legitimacy, anti-discrimination, human subjects protection, and last but not the least is animal care. Let's discuss first the first principle of ethical research, which is honesty and integrity. The researcher must honestly present information on the data, results, research methods, and procedures, and publication status. It is a must to achieve honesty in all science-related communication. It is prohibited to falsify and distort the data, to deceive colleagues, agencies aiding grants, or the public. The second principle is objectivity. It is recommended to try to avoid partiality and self-deception. The researcher must disclose any personal or financial interests that might influence this scientific research. Partiality should be avoided in the formulation of the research stages plan, analyzing and interpreting data, as well as evaluating the work of colleagues, recruiting the staff, writing applications for the award of grants, giving expert testimony, and other aspects of the scientific research where objectivity is essential. The third principle is morality. Morality refers that the researcher must comply with the promises and agreements, be honest, and seek the sustainability of thoughts and actions. Moving forward, for another principle of ethical research is prudence, which means that the researcher must avoid careless errors and omissions. It is important to evaluate carefully and critically both own and colleagues' work. It is proposed to collect, systematize good research-related activities such as data collection, planning research stages, and correspondence with agencies and journals, and the like. Next is openness. The researcher must share the data, ideas, tools, and resources, be open to criticism and new ideas. Next is respect for intellectual property. The researcher must respect patents, copyright rights, and other forms of intellectual property, not to use unpublished research data, methods, or results without permission. It is strictly forbidden for the researcher to plagiarize, which I will explain more on later. Next is confidentiality. This means that the researcher must save confidential information such as articles submitted for publication, records of employees, professional or military secrets, and the records of patients' health stories. Next is responsible publication. The researcher should publicize the results of the research for the sake of science and scientific research and not for the benefit of his career. So he should avoid unnecessary publication or republication. Next principle of ethical research is legitimacy. So the researcher must have the knowledge of relevant laws for his or her work as well as the institutional and government policies and comply with them. Next principle is the anti-discrimination. The researcher must avoid discrimination against students or colleagues of sex, race, nationality, and other factors unrelated to scientific excellence or honesty. The next principle is human subject protection. The researcher must respect human dignity, privacy, and autonomy. So conducting a research with human beings, the researcher must strive to minimize the damage and risk and maximize the benefit of the research. The researcher must also respect the human person as a human being, and he must also take special precautions working with vulnerable populations and seek a fair distribution of research benefits and burdens. And last but not the least principle is the animal care. So the researcher must respect the animals when using them for research studies and make sure that they are properly cared of. Now let's move forward to the Institutional Review Board. So before starting or conducting any study involving data collection with people, the researcher must submit his research proposal to an Institutional Review Board or IRB. So an IRB or IRBs are composed of researchers who evaluate research proposals to make sure that they follow ethical standards. So IRBs protect the safety of research participants. Their first task is to decide whether a proposed study increases participants' risk of injury, since psychological research can cause physical and/or psychological discomfort. So what do at risk or at minimal risk mean? Studies that put subjects at risk increase the chance of harm compared with not participating in the study. Minimal risk studies do not increase the likelihood of injury. So when should an IRB approve an at-risk study? So to get an IRB approval, it's important to explicitly note how the researcher tackled each of the ethical issues that may arise in his study. IRBs should approve an at-risk study when a risk-benefit analysis determines the risk to participants are outweighed by gains in knowledge. So why is approval for ethical research important? So ethical approval for research is necessary for the following reasons. First, to protect research participants' rights and welfare and reduce the risk of physical and psychological discomfort, damage, and/or threats appearing because of research procedures. Second is that to protect the rights of the researchers to carry out a lawful research and reputation of the university implementing or supporting the research. The third reason is that to reduce the probability of claims for negligence against scientific researchers, universities, and all cooperating persons or organizations. And the fourth reason is that because research funding agencies and scientific journals in their applications for getting research funding or as a condition necessary for publication are increasingly demanding ethical principles wording. Now let's move on to the different ethical issues in conducting research, including study design and ethical approval, data analysis, authorship, conflict of interest, and redundant publication, and plagiarism. So let's discuss first the first ethical issue in research, which is the study design and ethical approval. It is essential to obtain approval from the Institutional Review Board or Ethics Committee of the respective organizations for studies involving people and other data subjects. So according to COPE, which stands for Committee on Publication Ethics, good research should be well-adjusted, well-planned, appropriately designed, and ethically approved. To conduct research to a lower standard may constitute misconduct. The research proposal should discuss potential ethical issues pertaining to the research. The researchers should pay attention to vulnerable subjects to avoid breach of ethical codes. So examples of these are children, prisoners, pregnant women, mentally challenged, educationally and economically disadvantaged individuals. The second ethical issue is the data analysis. It is the responsibility of the researcher to analyze the data appropriately. Fabrication and falsification of data do constitute misconduct. So to ensure appropriate data analysis, all sources and methods used to obtain and analyze data should be fully disclosed. Moving forward, the next ethical issue in research is authorship. So there is actually no universally agreed definition of authorship. It is generally agreed that an author should have made substantial contribution to the intellectual content, including conceptualizing and designing the study, acquiring, analyzing, and interpreting the data. Since the author is usually involved in drafting or revising the manuscript, as well as approving the submitted manuscript, he should take responsibility to certify that the manuscript represents valid work and take public responsibility for the work. So it is crucial to decide early in the planning of a research who will be credited as authors, as contributors, and who will be acknowledged. It is also advisable to read carefully the advice to authors of the target journal, which may serve as a guide to the issue of authorship. Next is conflicts of interest. So this happens when researchers have interests that are not fully apparent and that may influence their judgments on what is published, including personal, commercial, political, academic, or financial interest. Financial interest may include employment, research funding, stock or share ownership, payment for lecture or travel, consultancies, and company support for staff. The researchers need to take extra effort to ensure that their conflicts of interest do not influence the methodology and outcome of the research. It would be useful to consult an independent researcher or ethics committee on this issue if in doubt. And the last issue in ethical research is the redundant publication and plagiarism. Redundant publication occurs when two or more papers without full cross-reference share the same hypothesis, data, discussion points, or conclusions. Plagiarism also means that it means that submitting others' works as your own. Although it can be unintentional, copying someone else's work without proper credit amounts to stealing. It's an ethical problem in research communication because you may benefit by harming other researchers. So plagiarism ranges from unreferenced use of others' published and unpublished ideas, including research grant applications, to submission under new authorship of a complete paper, sometimes in a different language. So after discussing the ethical principles and the issues of ethical research, I have here an example of an ethical research, which is the Nazi experiments. So Nazi doctors and researchers performed painful and horrific experiments on thousands of imprisoned people in concentration camps from 1942 to 1945. These experiments were inhumane and resulted in trauma, permanent disabilities, or death in many cases. The participation of prisoners was always forced, as consent was never sought. Participants often belonged to the marginalized communities, including Jewish people, disabled people, and the Roma people. So after some Nazi doctors were put on trial for their crimes, the Nuremberg Code of Research Ethics for Human Experimentation was developed in 1947 to establish a new standard for human experimentation in the medical research field. So before I end my presentation, I will leave you a quote from Dr. Hal Seymour-Roth, which states that science brings society to the next level, ethics keep us there. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day ahead.